Hi, welcome to this week's videos. This week we're only going to talk about pivot tables. And I'm going to guess that this is a little bit of a relief to you, because if you did last week's exercise, this is probably more or less what you ended up with. So I'm going to assume that you have seen enough new formulas for a week. So this week, no new formulas. We're only going to talk about how to analyze your data using pivot tables. Also, we're not doing the hardware store anymore. I think we've seen enough of the hardware store for a little bit. So this week, we're going to be running a bar. The spreadsheet for the bar is a little bit similar to the hardware case, because we again have an export from a register system where we keep track of everything that we sell in the bar. But we have some more information in this case, because in addition to the dates, the time, the type of beer that we're selling, and the quantity, we're also keeping track of who buys the beers. So let's assume all our customers have some sort of loyalty card, so we know exactly who buys what at which time, and that of course allows us to do a lot of nice analyses. So with this data, we also have a list of all the beers that we're selling in another worksheet. All the beers that are there, let's assume we just Googled for all the beers and we found a nice list of all beers. So of course a question that we could ask ourselves is, how many of each of the beer types have we been selling? So we can use a COUNTIF function for that. I'm sure this is a pretty familiar function by now. We look in the register log, how many times have we sold this specific beer? Simple, right? You already know that. So question, is this formula actually correct? Can you spot anything that might be wrong with this formula? I'll give you 1 second to think about it. So I hope you were yelling at your computer screen while I was pausing, because obviously there are a few things that are wrong with this formula. The first thing is that beers prefix. We don't need it. Excel adds it always if you switch worksheets, but it's actually better to remove it. But something else is wrong with this function. I don't think COUNTIF is the right thing to use, because we have a quantity there. So what we do with a COUNTIF is just count all the rows that are there. That's not what we want. We want to use the SUMIF function, because we want to have the sum of all those quantities we are selling. So we have to change our function a little bit, because now we also need to tell Excel what the column is that we're summing. And if we add that function, then the formula is correct. However, this formula is correct, but something is a little bit inconvenient here, because you see here in this time sold column, we only have zeros at this point, because the list of all the possible beers that we can sell is so long that the first ones just are not occurring. So I have to click sort, I have to go to the ribbon, click sort, say I want to have only the largest numbers on top, and then as you can see, we can see what beers we have exactly been selling. So it's quite a hassle to get everything done. And in addition to that, we could ask more difficult questions. Suppose our boss comes in, even though we changed our business from a hardware store to a beer shop, we still have the same boss. Isn't that interesting? And she asks very interesting questions, like what beers have been most sold after 11 p.m. This is probably interesting to know, because you want to know what beers are popular early in the evening and what beers are more popular late at night. So suppose we have to add an analysis like that, it's going to be a little bit cumbersome. Because first of all, we have to add another column saying what times are after 11. And your first intuition might be to use an if function there, but it's actually not needed. You can just use a comparison function as a proper formula in Excel. So here we try a first attempt. We say if the time is bigger than 23. However, that's not really working, because you see here in this case we have 11 p.m. However, we still get false. And the reason for that is the way that Excel works with times is that it saves the time as the fraction of the day. So 5 p.m. is more or less like 0.7 here. And you can see that if you change the time into a number. So for a proper comparison with times, we have to compare with a time. So we have the time, 23 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. And if we use that as a comparison, then we actually get through here in the case where the time is above 11. So I was cheating a little bit. I told you in the beginning of the video that I wouldn't show you any new formulas. This is a new formula, but I hope you're going to let this one go because it's very simple and it's only for time comparison. So with this function, we can now add our analysis because we can change our time solved from a sum if into a sum ifs, where we use multiple conditions to sum on. We have to change our formula a little bit because how the sum ifs works is we get first the column that we are summing and then a list of conditions. So we pick the quantity column first and then we say we want to have the name of the beer as the first condition. It has to be equal to the first column of the beers worksheet, and then the second condition is our time after 11 p.m. has to be true. So it's quite a long formula, but it gets the job done. However, as you can see here, the formula is now, the column is now not sorted yet because it's still sorted in the original order. So if you want to sort it, again, we have to click sort. Here you can see those values are not properly sorted yet. So if we click sort now, something strange happens. Here you see, hey, that is not the correct value. The links, again, have been updated. And that's because we forgot this time, I hope you were screaming again at the computer screen, we forgot to remove that beers prefix. So if we remove that, then we get the correct result. But that was a lot of work, right? A simple query, what beers are best sold after 11 p.m. We have to add another column, change our formula, and make sure that we don't forget to remove the prefixes and we don't forget to sort. So what I hope that you take away from these videos is formulas are meant for calculation. If you're calculating a sum or an average, a formula is fine. But as soon as you start to do really analysis, you're diving into your data, you're asking yourself questions like, what's the most popular beer on a Saturday if the temperature is below 0 degrees? Something like that. If you're analyzing your data, formulas quickly go out of hand. And I think you saw in this example that that just happens very quickly. So remember, formulas are not for analysis. And of course then, what is for analysis? Pivot tables. More about pivot tables in the next few videos. So, pivot tables. In the last video I showed you that formulas are really meant for calculation and not for detailed analysis of your data. So we can use a pivot table for that, and pivoting means turning around. Actually, I'm not entirely sure why a pivot table is called that. I like to think of it more as flattened tables, because what a pivot table does is it takes a whole bunch of data and it flattens it given a certain dimension. And this might sound very cryptic to you, so let's just go to our own data and make a pivot table. So we don't need that nasty calculation anymore. We're just going to select our entire register log and then we're going to insert a pivot table. So I've made a worksheet for you. You can select the data that you want and then you can say where you want to have it. New worksheet is fine, but I already made a pivot table worksheet. And what's important is that you add this data to the data model. I will talk about that later, but for now you just remember that this is always what you want. So Excel is now calculating and it has created a pivot table for us. So maybe you think, now what? Okay, we have a pivot table, but I don't know what to do with it. I don't see my data. What do I do? I'm a bit confused. So what you can see here is all the fields from our register log are available to us in the pivot table. If we go back to the register log, you see that all those column headers, Excel has detected, has looked at the data and saw that these are the column headers and placed them in the pivot table for you. So you can pick one and drag it down to the rows fields, and now it's going to calculate something. So you see all the beers that are in our register log are now in our pivot table. And this is in the sense that I mean a flattening table, because what happened is we had that entire register log, all these beers, and what the pivot table has done is it has flattened into only the beer names that are there. So here For example, the Schlafly Oktoberfest occurs twice, but in the flattened pivot table, it only occurs once. Only the unique values remain, as you can see here. But we're not really analyzing yet. Now we just have the list of beers. Of course, we want to do something with it. So what we can do is take that quantity and drag it to the value field. And what happens now, it is summing the quantity per beer. So while flattening the data, all the quantities that it encounters are summed. And if we sort it, we get the exact same result as we had when we were using the SUMIF function. We get 170 items sold for the Schlafly Oktoberfest beer. So now again, imagine that our boss comes in and says, what beer sells best after 11 p.m.? This is super easy because we can take the time field now and use it to filter our data. So we take time, we drag it down to the filter, and now we have the list of all times in a drop-down function. So we just say we want to select a bunch of them, we scroll down and we tick everything that's after 11 p.m. You could also use a formula for that, but just clicking is also super easy. And then we see that the best sold beer after 11 p.m. is the Schlafly Oktoberfest. We knew that from the SUMIFs function, but now we've done it without any formulas. So compare what I did in this video to what I did in a previous video. I didn't use any formulas. It was only importing my data into the pivot table, selecting the right fields, applying the right filter, and the analysis is there. And it's super easy for me now. If I want to know what's the best sold beer before 7 p.m., just changing the filter a little bit, no formulas needed, no change to any formulas needed, and I have my analysis. So a pivot table really allows us to play with our data in an easy fashion. So in the previous videos, we looked at how to use pivot tables for simple analysis, and in the following videos, we're going to really dive into all the possibilities that pivot tables have to offer. So this is what we ended up in the previous video. So what we could do now is add another row field. For instance, add the date. And now we get a stacked list of rows. So we get the type of beer, and underneath it, all the dates on which we have sold the beers. We can open and close them like a folder structure, and then we can investigate exactly at what date have we sold which beer. And we can swap them too, so we can make dates the highest level, and then we get for each date what are the beers we have sold at that date. And that makes it easy again to really dive into the data and to understand what are my customers doing, when are they drinking what type of drinks. What you see here, so far we've only looked at sums, but we can use all types of different functions there. We don't need to use sum. There's a lot of other functions that we can use if we go to the value settings below. If we click them, yes, there we go. If you click them, you can select a lot of other fields. So you see sum, but I can also use count or min or max. So let's pick average here. Let's pick the average amount of quantity that is being sold. And what does that exactly mean, the average amount of quantity? It's not the average of the entire column. What we get is the average per beer of whatever is in that quantity column. So you can see that if we sort the values, let's sort them so we can really see what's going on. Yeah, there we go. We sort the values, and we see that some beers are on average sold in a quantity of 2. So we can say that the chocolate stout is really a date beer. People buy it in duos, whereas a Bud Light is usually bought in bigger groups. And that sort of makes sense, I guess. You buy maybe a couple of Bud Lights for your friends, but a chocolate stout, you might buy that for your date. So by using an average function, we look at the data in an entire different way. We're not looking at the total, but while flattening the data, we're taking the average per each type of beer that we sell. So in this way, pivot tables allow us to really dive, again, I'm going to say this multiple times in this series, dive into the data and help us understand what it actually means. So I'm sure you've gathered by now that this week's videos are all about pivot tables. But what we have done so far is we've only looked at the analysis of one worksheet. We've only dug into this register log. But there's more in our spreadsheet, right? We have the list of beers. In addition to the times and the quantities, we also have different beers. And they are related, in a sense, to the beers in our beer list. And we have more information there because we add a brewery here, we know the type of the beer, we know the alcohol percentage. So we would like to analyze that, for instance, what is the alcohol percentage of our most sold beer, something like that. But we can't do that now because we don't have that information in our pivot table. We only have the information of the register log. So this video is all about how to combine multiple worksheets together into an overview pivot table. What we could do, of course, maybe you were yelling this again to your computer screen, is we could use a VLOOKUP. So if we want to have the brewery associated with each beer, we could just use a VLOOKUP. We set, of course, the final parameter to false, you know that by now. And then we have the brewery for each beer. And then we could do an analysis on the breweries. However, if we would continue this, we haul in the brewery, but we also haul in the alcohol percentage and the type and the category of beer, we get a lot of duplication. Basically, we're going to repeat the entire beers worksheet in the register log beer sheet. And what I hope you take away from this course is that you should really be aware of duplication. If you're doing the same thing a lot of times, probably you're not doing things in the easiest way, because I'm sure there's always a way to do things once and to repeat the analysis from there. So I hope maybe in a year or two, and you're working on your spreadsheet, and you think, hey, I've done this before an hour ago. I hope you remember me, and you think, oh, duplication is not a good idea. There should be an easier way to do this. I'm going to present that easier way to you in this video. So I promised you all the way back like 3 videos ago that this adding things to the data model is really important. And I'm going to come back at that promise right now. So we've added this data to the data model. It is stored somewhere. If we're going to do the same thing with our beers, we're making a pivot table of the beer list. And again, we're adding this data to the data model. We're putting it in another worksheet. I've made a worksheet called Beers Pivot, and this is where we place the pivot table for the beer list. So what you see here now, exactly as we saw in the previous pivot table, we have all the fields from our worksheet there, and we can do nice analyses on it, like the brewery, what is the number of different beers from this brewery. And we can sort, and then we can see this first brewery, the Midnight Sun Brewery, has 51 different beers. But what we're actually calculating now is the number of beers in the beer list, in this worksheet. There's no relation yet to the beers that we in our bar are actually selling. This is not the beers we're counting. We're counting the beers from the beer list. So now here's where the data model comes in. If we go to all data, we see that in addition to the data from this worksheet that we're analyzing right now, also the information from the register log is there. And this is because we have previously added this data to the data model. We can use the same data from the first pivot table in our second pivot table. So we've previously added this to the data model. That's what matters here. So now we can change our analysis. We can say, hey, we don't want to have the number of beers from the beer list. No, we want to have the number of beers from the register. That's the field that we want to add. So let's take that field, throw this away, and we drag in the number of beers. Now something interesting happens. Excel says, hey, I don't know how to do this. These two things aren't related. Basically what Excel is asking us, I don't know that VLOOKUP, the VLOOKUP that we manually made in the beginning, Excel doesn't know how to handle it. So we have to tell him what the exact relation between those two fields are. And you can see here how we do that. The things we were coupling in the VLOOKUP, we couple them together again. And if we do that now, we sort our data, then we can see what brewery sells the most popular beer in our actual bar. So we've made the connection between those two worksheets by adding both of them to the data model and then telling Excel the beer field in our register log is related to the name field in our beer list, and then we can make an analysis based on two different worksheets, all with pivot tables. Hi, welcome back. I can imagine that the last video left you a little bit confused because I was doing some magic here, just clicking fields together and suddenly everything worked. Maybe you were screaming at your computer screen again like, what's going on here? So in this video we're really going to look at what exactly happened there. So we're not going to work with adding a new pivot table anymore. Actually, secretly, you didn't know that, but secretly we were working with PowerPivot. So let's go to the PowerPivot worksheet and manage our data. And what you see here, that PowerPivot has stored all that data for us. The data that we have added to the data model. It's a little bit tricky. Actually, it should have said, add this data to a PowerPivot model, because PowerPivot is storing that data for us. And here you see the data in a diagram view. And if I click that link, you see that this is the link that I have actually created when I was clicking. I said, this is related to that. The beer is related to the name. So let's improve those names a little bit, because range and range 1 aren't good names. Let's rename them to register and beer so they align with what is in our spreadsheet model. So now we have a view of our data. This allows us to do some more cool analyses. For instance, we would like to know what countries do the beers that are popular in our bar stem from. So do we drink US beers? Do we drink German beers, Dutch beers maybe? We want to know that. But in order to do that, we need to have some more information. We need to go through the brewery worksheet, because the brewery worksheet has the information of what brewery is in what country. So we're not going to make another pivot table. We don't need to do that to add it to the data model. You know that we were secretly working with PowerPivot, so we can say now I want to go to the PowerPivot table ribbon and add the data to the data model directly. So you see here, we get all the data in a similar way that we got it before. All the column headers are right there. We can immediately rename it to breweries, and then we can create a relation. We don't need to go to the pivot table where Excel says, I need a relation, and then we create it. We can create it directly. We can say the brewery name in the beer worksheet is related to the name column in the brewery worksheet. And when we make that relation, we can use that to build our pivot tables on. So if we go to a pivot table now, you see that in addition to the register and the beers, we also have a list of breweries. And we can use that to make our country analysis. We can drag country in, and then we get the number of beers that we have sold for each of the countries. So what happens in the background is this country is linked to the beers through the brewery name, and those beers are linked to the beer list, to the register log in the beer name. So PowerPivot traverses all those relations, secretly in the background makes something like a VLOOKUP to hold all the data in, and then you can build a pivot table right on top of that. We don't need to do the actual VLOOKUPs. If we add everything to the data model and create the relations, we can build a pivot table on top of that. So let's look at the data again. What is the traversal that we go through? We go from the register log via the name through the brewery, from the brewery name through the brewery, and then through the country. So that's the exact same traversal that I did, but now I did it in the data instead of in the data model. So that leaves us with this pivot table in which we can see what are the beers that we have sold for each of the countries. So in the previous video, we did an analysis where we looked at what countries do our most popular beers stem from. But of course, if we're talking about geographical data like countries, maybe we could plot that on a map. And in our worksheet, we also have information about latitude and longitude. So wouldn't it be cool if we would have a map of the world that would show exactly where breweries are, where our most popular beers come from? Maybe we can plan a field trip to the closest, most popular brewery. So luckily, there's this super cool thing in Excel 2013 that's called PowerMap. And we're going to use that to do exactly that, plot our beers on a map. So you just click PowerMap once you have installed this plugin, and then you get a map right there, and all the data from our data model from PowerPivot is right there. So what we can do is drag just the breweries on, and you get little dots for all of the breweries. But this is based on the entire list of breweries, on the one worksheet, not yet on the connected list connected to what we are selling. In order for us to do that, we need to drag the quantity in, very similar to how we would do it in a normal pivot table. And what we get then is all the breweries with the quantity that we are selling in our bar. So we can see that this brewery right here, this is the La Trappe brewery, is kind of close to where our bar is. Let's assume our bar is in Delft, where this university is too. So we have a pretty popular brewery that's right close to Delft. That would be nice for a field tip. So what I've done now is I've also added the time dimension, and you get a little animation where you can see during the time, during the opening hours of our bar, you see the beers basically being drunk by the people in the bar, and you can play that time as an animation. And what we can furthermore do is add a category, so you see what type of beers stem from what brewery. So you see here, let me remove that, you see that blue is a certain type of beer and orange is another type of beer, and you see it right on your map. No formulas needed, you just drag your data in, you say these are the breweries, the quantities and the categories, and you get your visualization right on the map. So let's have a look at the rest of the world. We don't need to concentrate on Europe. If you look at the US, we see another interesting visualization. We see that here's a brewery of which 2 of the beers that are being sold are really popular. And here's an area in the US where a lot of breweries are popular. So maybe if we want to have a field trip very far away, this would be an interesting area of the US to actually go to. And again, I can't stress this enough. We didn't use any formulas. If we just load all our data into the PowerPivot data model, we can then use PowerMap, if it's geographical data, to plot everything on a map just by selecting the fields that we want to use. And that closes the entire week to show you the power of pivot tables, little use of formulas. You can just analyze your data by clicking and dragging. Isn't that nice? See you next week.